After being falsely accused of corporate sabotage and unceremoniously fired, a brilliant and loyal tech professional finds herself blacklisted, broke, and humiliated. But what begins as a tale of defeat transforms into an extraordinary journey of resilience, revenge, and redemption. Determined to rebuild her life and restore her reputation, she launches her own tech consultancy and rises to dominate the industry that once cast her out. Just as her company becomes a major player, she discovers her old employer is on the brink of collapse, and they come crawling to her for help. What follows is a dramatic power shift as she buys out the very company that ruined her, fires her corrupt ex-bosses, and exposes their shocking misconduct. But when an anonymous tip uncovers an even darker conspiracy tied to her former colleagues, the story takes a scandalous twist. What begins as a quest for justice spirals into a high-stakes battle against betrayal, corruption, and the haunting question, who can she really trust? This is a gripping story of betrayal, triumph, and a revenge so complete it will leave you speechless. 2 years ago, I had everything I thought I wanted, a promising career, the respect of my peers, and a comfortable place in one of the most sought-after tech companies in the industry. I had worked tirelessly to get there, pulling all-nighters, skipping holidays, and sacrificing weekends to climb the corporate ladder. The sacrifices felt worth it. I believed I was on my way to building a solid future, maybe even becoming a leader in the company one day. But I was naive. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. At first, I noticed that people stopped including me in conversations. Co-workers who used to grab coffee with me suddenly had excuses. Then came the hushed whispers when I entered the room, the abrupt silences when I walked by. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe everyone was just stressed about an upcoming product launch. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Then I found out about the rumors. "You've heard, right?" a colleague muttered to another one afternoon when they didn't realize I was standing nearby. About her? The data breach? Data breach? I froze in place, my mind spinning. I didn't even use my work laptop for personal stuff, let alone something as insane as leaking company data. But the moment they saw me, their faces paled, and they hurried off without saying another word. By the time I managed to piece things together, the damage was already done. Someone had started a rumor that I'd leaked confidential client data to a competitor. There was no proof, of course, because it wasn't true. But in the corporate world, proof doesn't always matter. Perception does. I marched straight to my manager, Greg, to clear things up. Greg had always been friendly, or so I thought. He'd been the one to hire me, mentor me, and even recommend me for a promotion the year before. Surely, he'd have my back. Instead, he barely let me speak. "This isn't personal," he said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "But we can't have this kind of distraction. The team needs to feel they can trust one another, and right now, there's tension." "Tension?" I asked, stunned. "Greg, I've done nothing wrong. You know my work ethic. You've seen the hours I've put in. This is insane." "I'm sorry," he said, but his eyes betrayed no real remorse. "We have to let you go." And that was it. I was fired. The humiliation hit me like a freight train as I was escorted out of the building with a security guard trailing behind me. My co-workers, people I'd worked alongside for years, avoided my gaze. A few whispered to each other as I passed, their faces a mix of pity and smug satisfaction. And then there was Janet. Janet was the queen bee of the office, the kind of person who always seemed to have her own agenda. We'd clashed more than once over project ideas, and she made it clear she didn't appreciate me overstepping into her territory. As I stepped outside with my cardboard box of belongings, Janet stood near the entrance, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed. When our eyes met, she smirked. "Guess you weren't as untouchable as you thought, huh?" she said with a laugh. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat burned with the effort of holding back tears. I just kept walking, my head down, wondering how my life had unraveled so quickly. The following weeks were some of the darkest of my life. Job interviews went nowhere. Every time I walked into a meeting, I could see the doubt in their eyes the moment they recognized my name. Greg and Janet must have spread the rumor beyond our office walls because no one wanted to take a chance on me. Bills started piling up. My savings dwindled. I stopped leaving my apartment except to buy groceries because I couldn't face the world. Friends stopped calling, unsure of what to say to someone whose career had imploded so spectacularly. I spent hours scrolling through social media, torturing myself with updates from former coworkers who were thriving while I was barely surviving. I saw Janet posting about her new leadership role in the company, bragging about how her team had landed a major client. She looked radiant in the photos, basking in the glow of her success, while I was stuck in sweatpants on my couch, eating instant noodles for dinner. The anger started as a flicker, a faint ember in the pit of my stomach. But with each passing day, it grew, feeding on my pain, my humiliation, and my overwhelming sense of injustice. I didn't deserve this. I had been loyal, hardworking, and honest. And they had thrown me away like I was nothing. One night, as I stared at my laptop screen, feeling completely defeated, an ad popped up. Learn how to start a company from scratch, it read in bold letters. A cheesy stock photo of a smiling entrepreneur accompanied the text, and under normal circumstances, I would have scoffed and clicked away. But that night, something shifted. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the anger simmering just below the surface. Or maybe it was the realization that no one was coming to save me. I clicked the ad. The course wasn't cheap, but I used what little money I had left to enroll. I figured I had nothing to lose. The first lesson was basic: defining your vision, setting goals, identifying your strengths. But as the weeks went by, the lessons became more detailed, more actionable. I started to see possibilities where before I'd only seen dead ends. Slowly but surely, I began to piece together a plan. If no one would hire me, I'd hire myself. If the industry wanted to shut me out, I'd create my own space. And if Greg, Janet, and everyone else thought they could destroy me, I'd prove them wrong. I worked harder than I ever had in my life. During the day, I researched, networked, and pitched ideas to potential clients. At night, I taught myself new skills, coding languages, marketing strategies, financial management. I barely slept. My tiny apartment became my war room, covered in sticky notes, charts, and notebooks filled with ideas. It wasn't easy. There were times I wanted to give up, times when the rejection emails piled up, and I questioned whether I was delusional for even trying. But every time I felt like quitting, I thought about Janet's smirk and Greg's dismissive tone. I thought about how they had taken everything from me, and I used that anger to push forward. And then, finally, after months of relentless effort, I landed my first client. It was a small startup looking to optimize their app. They didn't have much of a budget, but they were willing to take a chance on me. I poured everything I had into the project, working around the clock to deliver results that would blow them away. When I handed over the final product, the client was thrilled. They referred me to another company, and then another. Word of mouth spread, and soon, I had more clients than I could handle. I hired a small team to help me manage the workload, and before I knew it, my consultancy was growing faster than I ever imagined. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. And yet, I couldn't shake the thought of Greg and Janet. They had gotten away with ruining my career, and I couldn't let that stand. I didn't just want to succeed. I wanted justice. Success didn't come easy, but it tasted even sweeter because of the battles I had fought to get there. My small consultancy had grown into something real, a legitimate competitor in the tech industry. Within a year, I had a team of 10 employees, an office space, and a client roster that included startups and mid-sized firms eager to grow. It felt like a dream, but there was one thought I couldn't let go of. Greg and Janet. They had stolen so much from me. My job, my reputation, my confidence. And while I had clawed my way back, they hadn't paid for what they did. They were still out there, reaping the benefits of their lies while I had to start over from scratch. I wasn't the kind of person to obsess over revenge. Or at least, I didn't used to be. But their betrayal haunted me. I couldn't forget Janet's smirk or the way Greg had dismissed me like I was disposable. Every success I achieved only reminded me of what they'd taken. And slowly, a plan began to form. I didn't act on it right away. At first, I focused on growing my business and establishing myself as a force to be reckoned with. I wanted to make sure I was untouchable before I went after them. So I worked harder than ever, expanding my services, hiring more employees, and securing contracts with bigger clients. Then one day, fate handed me an opportunity one couldn't ignore. It started with an unexpected email from a recruiter. The subject line caught my eye immediately: consultancy needed for high-profile client. I opened the email and nearly choked on my coffee. The client in question: my former employer. I read the email twice, then a third time, just to be sure I wasn't imagining things. The company I had once worked for, the same company that had fired me without cause, was now struggling. They were losing clients, their revenue was dropping, and their internal structure was in chaos. Apparently, they were desperate for help. I should have felt vindicated, but instead, I was furious. After everything they had done to me, they were now seeking help from someone like me. It was almost laughable. I debated whether to even respond. A part of me wanted to tell them to go to hell, but another part, the part that still burned with resentment, knew this was my chance. I replied to the email and set up a meeting with Greg. When the day of the meeting arrived, I was ready. My assistant ushered him into my office, and the look on his face when he saw me was priceless. His jaw dropped, and for a moment, he just stood there, stunned. "Greg," I said, smiling as I gestured for him to take a seat. "It's been a long time." He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. I didn't realize you were the CEO of this company." "Life's full of surprises," I said smoothly, watching him squirm. Greg tried to regain his composure, but I could tell he was rattled. He launched into a rehearsed spiel about how the company had been facing challenges and how they needed outside expertise to help them turn things around. I listened politely, nodding in all the right places, but inside, I was seething. He spoke as if we were strangers, as if he hadn't destroyed my career and left me to fend for myself. The audacity was almost impressive. When he finished his pitch, I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers. "So, let me get this straight," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "You want me, someone you fired without cause, to help you save your company?" Greg's face flushed. "It wasn't personal," he mumbled. "Really? Because it sure felt personal when you accused me of something I didn't do and ruined my reputation in the process." He had no response to that. For a moment, the room was silent. Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding my gaze. I let the silence stretch, enjoying the power dynamic for the first time since this whole mess began. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Look, I know we've had our differences in the past, but this is business. And you're clearly one of the best in the industry now. That's why we're coming to you." It took everything in me not to laugh. The irony was almost too much. "Here's the thing, Greg," I said, leaning forward. "I'm not interested in helping you for a consulting fee. But I am interested in something else." He raised an eyebrow, clearly unsure of where I was going with this. "I want your company," I said bluntly. "Sell it to me, and I'll turn it around." His eyes widened in shock. "That's not an option," he stammered. "We're not looking to sell." "Then I can't help you," I said, standing to signal that the meeting was over. Greg scrambled to his feet, panic flashing across his face. Wait. Let's not be hasty. Maybe there's a compromise we can reach. I shook my head. I don't do compromises, Greg. Not anymore. You can either sell me the company, or you can find someone else to clean up your mess. But let me tell you something, there's a reason you're here, asking for my help. No one else is going to save you. I could see the wheels turning in his head. He knew I was right. The company was on the brink of collapse, and they didn't have many options left. I'll talk to the board, he said finally, his voice tight. But I can't make any promises. That's fine, I said with a smile. Take your time. Just don't wait too long. You might not have a company left to sell. After Greg left, I felt a surge of adrenaline. I had just laid my cards on the table, and now it was a waiting game. But I wasn't worried. I knew how desperate they were, and I knew they would come back. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, I got the call. They had agreed to sell. I spent the next few months finalizing the acquisition, carefully reviewing every detail to make sure I wasn't inheriting more problems than I could handle. The process was exhausting, but every time I felt like giving up, I reminded myself of why I was doing this. This wasn't just about business. It was about justice. About taking back what was mine. The day the papers were signed, I walked into the office that had once been my prison and called for an all-hands meeting. The employees, many of whom I still recognized, gathered in the conference room, whispering among themselves. Greg and Janet stood in the back, looking uncomfortable but trying to hide it. I took my place at the front of the room and looked out at the crowd, letting the silence settle before I spoke. Some of you know me, I began, my voice steady. And some of you don't. But for those of you who do, you'll remember that I used to work here. I was one of you. The room went silent. And then, I continued, I was fired. Without cause. Without justification. I was accused of things I didn't do and thrown away like I was nothing. I let that hang in the air for a moment, my eyes locking on Greg and Janet. Both of them looked pale, their confidence crumbling under the weight of my words. But I'm not here to dwell on the past, I said, my tone sharp. I'm here because I believe this company can be saved. But it won't be saved by the people who ran it into the ground. I turned to Greg and Janet. You're both fired. The room fell into a stunned silence as my words echoed off the walls. You're both fired. Greg's face flushed a deep crimson. Janet, ever the queen of arrogance, crossed her arms and let out a humorless laugh. You can't be serious, she said, her voice sharp and defensive. You think you can just waltz back in here and throw us out like this? We've built this company. I raised an eyebrow at her. Built it? Janet, you've run it into the ground. The company is hemorrhaging clients, profits are at an all-time low, and morale in this office is non-existent. That's not building anything. That's destroying it. Greg tried to step in, his voice trembling slightly. You can't just. Oh, but I can, I interrupted, my tone calm but firm. You see, Greg, unlike the way you handled my dismissal, this isn't a rumor or a knee-jerk reaction. It's a business decision. A good one. And as the new owner of this company, I get to make the decisions now. I saw the flicker of panic in his eyes, and it was deeply satisfying. This isn't over, Janet hissed, her face twisted with anger. You'll regret this. No, Janet, I said, meeting her gaze head-on. The only thing I regret is trusting people like you in the first place. Pack your things. Both of you. You're done here. The employees in the room looked shocked, but I could see the glimmers of approval in some of their eyes. Greg and Janet had ruled through intimidation and manipulation, and their downfall was long overdue. Greg looked like he wanted to argue, but one look at the cold determination on my face told him it was pointless. Janet, on the other hand, stormed out of the room in a huff, muttering under her breath. Greg followed her, his shoulders slumped in defeat. When they were gone, I turned back to the rest of the team. "I know this is a lot to take in," I said, addressing the group. "And I know some of you may be wondering what's going to happen next. But let me assure you of one thing, this is a fresh start. For all of us." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I've been in your shoes. I know what it feels like to come into work every day, unsure of where the company is headed or whether your contributions even matter. That's going to change. I'm committed to rebuilding this company from the ground up, and I want all of you to be a part of that." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Some faces looked skeptical, others intrigued. I couldn't blame them for being hesitant. I was, after all, the person who had just fired their leadership team in front of everyone. But I also knew I had planted the seed of something new. That was all I needed. In the weeks that followed, I wasted no time getting to work. The first order of business was assessing the damage Greg and Janet had done. It wasn't pretty. The company's finances were in worse shape than I'd realized, and several key clients were on the verge of leaving. The internal culture was toxic, with employees feeling undervalued and overworked. I met with every single employee individually, from junior staff to department heads, to hear their concerns and ideas. Most of them were hesitant at first, unsure of whether I was genuinely interested in their input or just putting on a show. But as I listened, really listened, they began to open up. I learned about the arbitrary deadlines Janet had imposed, forcing people to work late nights and weekends for no real reason. I heard stories of Greg taking credit for ideas that weren't his and punishing anyone who dared to challenge him. It was worse than I had imagined, but it also gave me a clear picture of what needed to change. One of the first things I did was implement a more transparent and collaborative workflow. I created a forum where employees could share ideas and feedback anonymously, ensuring that everyone's voice could be heard without fear of retaliation. I also overhauled the company's policies on work-life balance, instituting reasonable hours and encouraging people to take time off when they needed it. The changes didn't happen overnight, and not everyone was on board at first. But little by little, the culture began to shift. People started coming to work with a renewed sense of purpose, and the office, once stifled by tension, began to feel alive again. But there was still the issue of the company's reputation. The rumors Greg and Janet had spread about me 2 years ago hadn't disappeared. If anything, they had tainted the company's image, making it harder to attract new clients. I knew that if I wanted to truly rebuild, I needed to confront those rumors head-on. So, I did something bold. I reached out to the industry's top publications and offered to share my story. Not as an act of revenge, but as a way to set the record straight and inspire others who had been wronged. In a series of interviews, I detailed my journey, how I had been falsely accused, fired, and blacklisted, only to come back stronger and take control of the very company that had tried to destroy me. I spoke openly about the challenges I'd faced and the lessons I'd learned along the way. The response was overwhelming. The articles went viral, sparking conversations about workplace toxicity, corporate accountability, and the power of resilience. My inbox was flooded with messages from people who had been through similar experiences, thanking me for sharing my story and giving them hope. But the most surprising response came from my former clients. Several of them reached out after reading the articles, apologizing for believing the rumors and cutting ties with me. They expressed interest in working together again, and within weeks, I had secured contracts that brought in enough revenue to stabilize the company's finances. Things were finally starting to fall into place. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that my journey wasn't over. Greg and Janet were gone, the company was on the mend, and my reputation had been restored. But deep down, I knew there was one final chapter to this story, one last piece of justice waiting to be delivered. I didn't have to wait long. One afternoon, I got a call from a mutual acquaintance who worked in the industry. He mentioned, almost casually, that Greg and Janet had started their own consulting firm. They were pitching themselves as industry veterans, with years of experience turning companies around. The audacity of it was almost laughable. But what really caught my attention was that they were trying to poach clients from my company. It was a move I should have expected, but it still ignited something inside me. They had already tried to ruin me once, and now, even after everything I'd accomplished, they were still trying to undermine me. If they wanted to play this game, I was ready. I began digging into their new firm, learning everything I could about their operations. It didn't take long to find cracks in their foundation: poorly structured contracts, unqualified hires, and overpromising on deliverables they couldn't possibly achieve. They were sloppy, reckless, and vulnerable. And I knew exactly how to exploit that. It was time to finish what they had started. Greg and Janet were sloppy. Their desperation to carve out a slice of the industry, an industry I had dominated in the wake of my comeback, had blinded them to the finer details. Their firm was built on arrogance and hollow promises, just like their careers had been. But I wasn't just going to sit back and watch them fail on their own. No, I had a score to settle, and this time, I wasn't leaving anything to chance. I dug deeper into their business. A little too deep, perhaps. Using the same instincts I'd honed building my company from the ground up, I pieced together their client list, their pricing structure, and even the internal turmoil brewing within their team. It wasn't hard. Greg and Janet had no clue how to lead, and their employees were frustrated enough to spill secrets in casual conversations at industry events. What I uncovered, however, was more than I expected. Greg and Janet weren't just incompetent, they were corrupt. They had been falsifying metrics and forging client reports to inflate their success. Their entire firm was a house of cards, teetering on the edge of collapse. And all it would take was one little push to bring the whole thing down. But as tempting as it was to expose them outright, I decided to take a more calculated approach. It started with their clients. I reached out to a few of them, discreetly, offering to audit their accounts for free. Most of them didn't know me personally but had heard of my company's reputation for integrity and results. Within weeks, I had detailed reports in my hands that showed just how much Greg and Janet had been overcharging them for incomplete or shoddy work. The clients were furious. One by one, they began pulling their contracts, leaving Greg and Janet scrambling to stop the bleeding. But that was just the beginning. Next, I approached their employees, quietly, of course. It wasn't hard to convince them to jump ship. Many of them were overworked, underpaid, and fed up with the toxic environment Greg and Janet had created. I hired the best of them, offering fair salaries and a healthy work culture they couldn't resist. Suddenly, Greg and Janet didn't just have a client problem, they had a staffing crisis. By the time their firm was down to a skeleton crew, I was ready for my final move. I contacted a journalist from one of the top tech publications, someone I'd worked with before during my redemption arc. I handed over everything I had, proof of the falsified metrics, the inflated invoices, the mismanagement. I didn't ask for anything in return. I didn't need to. I knew the story would write itself. And it did. The article hit the industry like a bombshell. Exposé: The Rise and Fall of Greg and Janet's Corrupt Consulting Empire. It detailed everything: how they had lied to clients, exploited their employees, and built their firm on fraud. The article went viral, and within hours, their company's website went offline. I thought that would be the end of it. I had exposed them, destroyed their credibility, and ensured they could never rebuild. But what happened next was something I never could have predicted. 2 weeks after the article was published, I received an anonymous tip from a source I didn't recognize. It came in the form of an email, with a single line of text: "There's more to the story than you know." Attached was a file labeled evidence.zip. Against my better judgment, I opened it. What I found left me speechless. Inside were dozens of documents, emails, bank statements, and even recorded phone calls. They detailed a scheme far more sinister than I'd imagined. Greg and Janet hadn't just been defrauding clients, they had also been laundering money for a shady investor who had funded their startup. The investor, it turned out, was connected to a network of illegal activities, including embezzlement and offshore tax evasion. The more I read, the sicker I felt. This wasn't just a case of corporate greed or workplace betrayal. This was criminal. At first, I wasn't sure what to do. Part of me wanted to wash my hands of the whole thing. I'd already gotten my revenge, and I wasn't sure I wanted to dive deeper into this mess. But then I thought about all the people Greg and Janet had hurt, the clients they'd cheated, the employees they'd exploited. They needed to be held accountable. I forwarded the files to the authorities. The investigation moved quickly. Within weeks, Greg and Janet were arrested, and their scandal became the talk of the industry. News outlets covered it relentlessly, painting them as villains who had abused their power and betrayed everyone around them. I thought I'd feel satisfied, but instead, I felt empty. Their downfall should have been my moment of triumph, the culmination of everything I'd worked for. But as I watched their mugshots flash across the news, I realized that no amount of revenge could undo the damage they'd done to me or erase the pain I'd felt. A few days later, I received another email, this time from someone I hadn't heard from in years. It was Greg. The message was short. You got what you wanted. But you should know, we weren't the only ones involved. Be careful who you trust. My blood ran cold. I stared at the email for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. Was he bluffing? Trying to manipulate me one last time? Or was there truth to his words? In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I started to question everything, the anonymous tip, the timing of the investigation, even my own rise to success. Had someone else been pulling the strings all along? And if so, who? I don't have the answers yet. But one thing is certain, my story isn't over.